The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. From the studios of Asheville FM, 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. If you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you're free to do so. If you choose to do it, just send us an email. If you care to, you can send us letters at the Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville, specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
You're hearing the second half of my conversation with Kevin Tucker. Kevin is an anarcho-primitivist, author of numerous essays, editor of Black and Green Review, and a founder of Black and Green Press. Check out their site, blackandgreenpress.org, for things they've released. Keep an ear out in the next month for issue number 5 of Black and Green Review, and go ahead and check out the first half of our chat at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org.
But first, here is one kind of editorialized announcement. Online platform The Tennessean has recently been reporting of several white nationalist rallies, called White Lives Matter rallies, that are planned for October 28th in Shelbyville and Murfreesboro, Tennessee, among perhaps one other town. These spots were chosen by the event organizers, most visibly Brad Griffin, who writes under the alias Hunter Wallace on the blog Occidental Dissent, because of the state's Republican and red status, coupled with a mistrust of law enforcement in what they're calling, quote, more democratic towns, end quote. According to a statement that they released on Saturday, the National Socialist Movement, a pro-white organization based out of Detroit, Michigan, said the group's street action would be broadening its scope to include other small Tennessee towns in the vicinity of Nashville. This same statement claims participation by other groups such as League of the South and the Traditionalist Workers' Party. It's not known how many people will be attending at this time, though the organizers are predictably posturing that it will be a well-attended event. The stated purpose of these events is to protest the changing demographic of Middle Tennessee, silence from the White House regarding a fatal church shooting in Antioch last month, in which the perpetrator started his early life in Sudan but was a U.S. citizen, and probably some other white nationalist nonsense as well. According to interviews posted a couple of days ago by WCVS, residents of both Shelbyville and Murfreesboro are both angered at this group's presence and confused about why their hometown was chosen. Many statements include disgust at the very message of white nationalism and White Lives Matter. It's believed by residents that these groups are outside agitators who are descending on them to disrupt their town and their already scheduled community events, and by doing so are making implicit assumptions about their way of life and of thinking. All the organizing information is attempting to draw a clear link between these events and the by now internationally famous events in Charlottesville, Virginia, of August 12th this year, even though that day was a clear loss for those on the side of the alt-right. Despite claims, also by the organizers, that the event, quote, will not be violent, police are gearing up in those cities to prepare for the rallies. Just last night, October 7th, in that same city of Seville, Richard Spencer showed his face and formed a 30-strong, 10-minute-long torch march around the doomed Lee Monument scheduled for removal in Emancipation Park, the site of their previous defeat. Predictably, police were heavy allies to the Nazis and escorted them away under their protection. If you are disgusted by this, you can call the folks at the CPD and ask them why they're still helping neo-Nazis do their thing here in 2017. They can be reached at 434-970-3280. In this post-Seville landscape of frenzied and often disorganized white nationalist activity, it is perhaps important to keep these things in our sights and oppose them as best we can. The exact location of the event has not yet been released, but it might be reasonable to assume that the information will be posted on Griffin's blog a day or two beforehand. For more information about developments, keep eyes on your favorite anarchist and anti-fascist news sources.
Too busy trying to survive capitalism's daily grind to get caught up on the latest anarchist news? Or maybe you're so wrapped up in your own organizing that it's hard to make time to hear about other liberatory struggles. This Rebel Girl has got you covered. Tune in every Wednesday for new episodes of The Hotwire, a 30-minute podcast with the latest anarchist news, on-the-ground interviews, a repression roundup, political prisoner birthdays, and announcements for upcoming events. All this and more at crimethink.com.
Too hot. This town is too hot.
But first, here are some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a what?
I can remember 15 years ago or so, before the invasion of Iraq, there was a young girl who played for her high school basketball team, and during the playing of the national anthem, she turned her back. I don't remember a lot of the details, but I think she took a lot of flack for her protest and maybe even faced suspension from school. More recently, NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick has taken a knee during the national anthem, a protest not quite as radical as turning one's back. The NFL hasn't overtly sanctioned Kaepernick, but he's no longer a starting quarterback, even though his quarterback rating is higher than a few current starters. So it is easy to think that Kaepernick's marginalization is related to his protest. Taking a knee during the anthem has now spread to other teams and other sports and provoked the Twitter-in-chief to attack the protests as unpatriotic. Of course, that only caused even more widespread protests during the national anthem. In the debate since then, critics of the protests have said that the national anthem is not the proper forum for protest, that NFL players and others ought to take a knee before the anthem or after the anthem, or choose some other forum. Others agree with the buffoon in the White House that protests during the anthem are unpatriotic. So let's unpack some of this. First, the idea that protesters should protest at some other time or forum. If Colin Kaepernick had taken a knee in the parking lot or had taken a knee after the anthem, do you think anyone would have noticed? Exactly. The point of public protest is to gain public attention. So expecting protesters to protest only in ways that do not gain public attention and to forego protests that get massive amounts of public attention makes about as much sense as expecting kids at a pizza party to opt for the broccoli. Not going to happen. Second, the idea that protests are unpatriotic. I seem to recall some famous dead guy once said that patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels. What debt of patriotism do we owe to a nation or to a government that has so little regard for us? On a regular basis, we see agents of this government think it's more than a little bit irrational to expect these folks who are in the crosshairs of this trigger-happy death machine to continue pledging their unconditional allegiance. That makes no sense. This expectation of patriotism is really pathological. To me, this is like abusive parents who put out cigarettes on their kids' arms, expecting those same brutalized kids to unconditionally love those abusive parents. That seems to me to be an infantile sense of entitlement. This expectation that we should act like we love someone or something that doesn't act like it loves us back. Somehow, an abusive parent or a neglectful government is entitled to our allegiance, no matter how much either of them do not live up to their responsibilities to us? I don't think so. To maintain dedication to someone or something that is not dedicated to you is unhealthy. It's more than dysfunctional. It's self-hating. When we continue to sacrifice our happiness for the abusive parent, or when we continue to seek the approval of a neglectful government, we are participating in pathological self-harm. In the case of non-whites in the United States, patriotism is suicide. For non-whites, pledging unconditional allegiance to this nation and its governmental system is to give a personal stamp of approval to the systematic slaughter of their own loved ones. Even symbolic consent, like standing for the national anthem, is participating in public ceremony for a system engaged in crimes against humanity, and crimes against one's own family and friends and community. A long time ago, Henry David Thoreau refused to pay his taxes in protest of slavery and the U.S. provoking the Mexican-American War. He went to jail. His good friend Ralph Waldo Emerson came to visit, smiled a rueful smile through the bars at his friend, and, being funny, asked, "What are you doing in there, Henry?" But Henry David Thoreau, convinced as he was of the rightness of his cause, responded, "No, Ralph, the question is, what are you doing out there?" So to borrow from Thoreau, I think the question that confronts us is not how those taking a knee could be so unpatriotic. I think the question is, how can anyone seeing what's really going down still remain standing? The question isn't what's wrong with those taking a knee. The question is what's wrong with those who are not. All that evil needs in order to prevail is for good people to remain standing. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from War and Corruption in Lebanon, Ohio. If you're taking a knee during the national anthem, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at SeanSwain243-205, Warren CI, P.O. Box 120, 5787 State Route 63, Lebanon, Ohio, 45036. Updates on his situation and more writings by Sean can be found at seanswain.org.
Do you mind if I broach off in a different direction for just a moment? Because we don't need to talk about it for very long, but I think it was a On the Media episode that I was listening to recently, because they have some interesting commentary from time to time, but they had, during one of their, I think last week's episode, they had talked to a few medieval scholars about the rise in far-right appropriation of medieval European or like Stone Age, maybe not, Bronze Age era history or imagery in the far right imagination. And there have been comparisons made between anti-civilization perspectives coming out of the West and the far right in terms of idealizing a certain time frame in which people lived, saying that like, oh well, back in the golden age we lived, in this idyllic period when things were in balance, our nature was in balance, and we were strong. And it's often tied to a specific patriarchal, ethnic, like racialized framework, because you keep coming back to egalitarian society in a way, and that seems distinctly in opposition to the highly patriarchal and stratified vision that a lot of people have when they think about the good old days before civilization or before Christianity or before Judaism or before whatever. Sorry, it's kind of like a scattershot question and kind of off the far left side, but is there a way that you could address that?
No problem. And I mean, people say, this is why I call myself an anarcho-primitivist. I am both of those things. Primitivism on its own is a pretty useless term. It's been around for art critique itself for like 200 years. Really just means a more primitive version or an earlier version. And it does tend to have a lot of that kind of romanization. You can get into the terms. Obviously, there's issues with the terms. And I think that I'm fine using anarcho-primitivism because I think we've done a good job of distancing a lot of the baggage, and I never refer to primitives. Like I just don't use the term, even though I use primitivism. It's just kind of a catch-all. But we're talking about, and again, this is where a lot of the Shepard influence comes from, and a lot of the entire understanding that we're trying to push here is innately dehistoricizing what it means to be human, or looking at these human societies. So I'm not talking about a golden age of the Kung in the 1930s or the perfect society or anything like that. It's like there is no perfect society. There's societies that function better than others. There's good people. There's people at times who do bad things. I mean, we're humans. We're animals. You know, we fuck up from time to time. We don't need to be perfect. We just either we work or we don't. And there's a lot of balances and a lot of things that happen within a hunter-gatherer society, the ability to move, the ability to break apart, and the ability to accept just from the get-go that certain people aren't always going to get along. And the way to deal with that is say, well, then those people should move apart. They should just split apart. There's nothing that ties them. There's no tribal identity within these egalitarian societies. And that's where things really split off. We're talking about our genome. We're talking about what it is that we are as Homo sapiens, as social animals, and the way that we interact with each other. And so it's not about some golden era or anything like that. It's like, this is you. This is what you've been. You're a captive. Those people like, Paul Wagner is a nomadic hunter-gatherer art, and he's defying it just as much as anybody else. And I absolutely reject any notion that there's something about primitivism that puts us in line with what I call bro-tribalists, which talking about the wolves, talking about the werewolves, talking about this neo-pagan horseshit.
Jack Donovan's one of them, is that right?
Yeah, Jack Donovan, Paul Wagner.
Yep.
And I do see that there are people who have associated with anarcho-primitivism who've kind of gone for this, and it's really this sheepish kind of overreactionary, we're tired of people on the left telling us that everything we do is culture appropriation. We're tired of having to have arguments with people on social media all the time. So, hey, if everything's cultural appropriation, then I'm going to appropriate my own culture, and that has meaning and value. It's like, no, it doesn't. It was like the whole Vinland thing, the whole pagan thing was shitty at the time. They were colonizers. They were doing conquest and all these things. The entire concept of Vinland is right of conquest. It's like, I'm against all of this. They're searching for a group identity, and it is the epitome of a point that's underlying a lot of this that I haven't gotten to that Paul Shepard really nailed, which is neoteny. It's the way that domestication breaks our development process as social animals and runs us. It makes it so that we're effectively never out of the adolescent stage. So we're still constantly trying to find ourselves, and by constantly trying to find ourselves, we're willing to buy any narrative that we're sold that sounds good. So civilization and civilizers weren't smart enough to develop religion out of thin air. Hunter-gatherers, I'm working on a book about this now, so it's going from Emil Durkheim's definition of religion. It has to have a church. It has to have an ethos, a morality, and a form of worship of a deified culture. And when you look at hunter-gatherer, what we call hunter-gatherer religion, they don't have it. They don't have omnipotent gods, and even gods and creators that they do have, they did their part in the story, they did their part in the myth, and that's it. They have no impact on life as it currently is, which is kind of the definition of God from what we understand. But missionaries came in and then just tried to bulldoze everything they knew and work with the kind of framework that had existed in myth and turn it into the story of God and the story of creation. In fact, it was the exact same thing that the Vinland people were wanting to do. So there are things that we need as social animals, and that's where these impulses come from. We need community. We want to be around each other. We want to be able to have healing dances and trance dances and coming together and bonding through singing and dealing with trauma and dealing with issues that arise as just a matter of fact of being a living, breathing being. There's issues that arise. There's things that are hard about hunter-gatherer life. There's things that are hard about all life. All of us have to deal with death. All of us have to deal with illness and things like that, and things that we can't necessarily explain, but they pull together as a community and go through it. And within our society, it goes through churches, it goes through sports, it goes through militaries, it goes through nationalism, and creating these identities that we grasp onto instead of becoming individuals or becoming a part of a community and not having to second guess yourself all the time. So all these people who are doing this shit, they're looking for identities, the same as most people are, but it's based on all these myths of domination and all this kind of tough guy shit that's going to make basically weak white people feel empowered. And they, it's the same thing with alt-right. It's the same thing with all these groups that have been arising, even in mass culture, obviously at large. I mean, going back to slaveholders and going back to apartheid and looking at areas where white people were the minority or ruling people were the minority in another area, so they took over by force. And it's just this cosmic projection of their own insecurities and weaknesses.
And not how we have to be as a species, and maybe, I mean, at least as far as like a mass organized warfare, that's not the sort of thing that was possible through the majority of human existence, right?
Absolutely, and that was the focus on my main essay in Black and Green Review number 4, Society Without Strangers, the idea of warfare as the backbone of group identity. If you're a nomadic hunter-gatherer, you're living in bands of 25 people on average, 25 to 40 people on average, and having affiliation with 500 to 1,000 people, and you can move back and forth at any given time, then it pretty much naturally abolishes any concept of a border or a group identity, and nobody has social power in order to organize people to initiate a blood feud or something like that. I mean, these things are absolutely 100% tied to domestication, and that's something that's demonstrably true, despite what household programmers like Steven Pinker might say. I guess just to sum it up, for anybody who's listening and thinking it's like, okay, we're idealizing slightly different points in time or something like that, it's like, no, we're talking about human nature. We're talking about how we are as a species, as communities, and being egalitarian, and how important that is to us as a species on an evolutionary scale, let alone a personal social scale, not just looking for a place to tie ourselves in. And they're appropriating their own culture in a sense, which is, again, it's horseshit. I mean, if you're, I'm looking at myself, I'm a white male. I am the amalgam of, thousands of years of being colonized and colonizer. I have no European identity. I'm just a buckshot of Eastern European and going into Middle Eastern societies and what are now those nations. I mean, it's like most of these people are the same thing. It's like you want to take pride in being something that you had to construct just to feel that your life had meaning. I have no affinity with any of it. And obviously the misogynist, patriarchal warrior shit. Good luck, guys. Just kidding. I hope you fail.
Yeah, that's the right answer. So you mentioned collapse before, and there was a big thing I remember like 15 years ago is when I came across it, but around the idea that civilization was going to collapse and the way that I imagined that was that suddenly we would wake up one day and the cars wouldn't work. It'd be like an EMP sort of thing. And I think it's interesting, like how I've seen throughout my life, how not like necessarily ecological collapse, although I'm sure that the systems that are in place have people that are paid to sort of find ways to profit off of this, but how the tendency of society or of civilization to collapse creates a momentum that just stumbles it forward faster and faster. And maybe I just haven't seen it come to the point where it goes over the cliff, but it seems like capitalism in particular is very good at recuperating changes. And when a population gets a feeling of destabilization and their faith in a certain system shifts or becomes destabilized, that the system is able to take that somehow to its advantage, or an element or a faction within society or civilization is able to take that as an advantage, so that rather than having a new opportunity ahead of us, we just have a new group of bosses with different faces and a slightly different ideology, but the same running motion. So I'm wondering, in terms of collapse, what do you mean when you use the term?
The basic definition of collapse, not even talking from my own perspective, but from like a social sciences kind of take on collapse, because this is like a huge area of study, archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, looking at collapse, and it basically just means a simplification of the complexity of that society. So it's a really basic definition. You could say that the USSR collapsed into Russia in a sense, which is not an example I would ever really use. But I mean, you could look at the same time to say it's like before the Bolshevik Revolution and during the Bolshevik Revolution, the way that the industrialization of agriculture happened in Russia basically just made it so that the collapsing oligarchy was able to kind of get an extended lifeline that didn't take off particularly well. But, that's just kind of one example. So on one side of things, you've got kind of minor instances like that you can refer to as a collapse. But realistically, what we're talking about is where the society hits what Joseph Tainter called the point of diminishing returns, in which it was putting in more than it was getting out, and it became unsustainable, and at that point, forced simplification or reduction or complete destruction of that society. As such, it's a fact of any kind of society that steps outside of, really sustainable, prolonged subsistence practices. And it's happened with horticultural societies, it happens obviously with agricultural societies, and it happens, of course, with civilizations, particularly with industrial civilizations. But the thing to keep in mind, and I always make a point of really showing this, is like domestication isn't an event. It's not like, 10,000 years ago something happened, the world changed from hunter-gatherers to horticulturalists, and then all this stuff, yada, yada, yada. The whole narrative progress, it doesn't add up. It doesn't exist. But domestication is a constant, ongoing process. This, as Shepard pointed out with neoteny, this process of runting doesn't end. It has to have constant reinforcement. And civilization, to me, is 5% innovation, 95% maintenance. And we give a lot of attention to that innovation because for us it looks like we've solved these problems. In reality, we haven't. And I think a lot of my perspective on collapse and understanding collapse as a process also comes from the fact that I grew up across the river from Cahokia, which is a dead civilization in East St. Louis, which is a dying civilization. Everybody I knew who grew up in East St. Louis had asthma and breathing issues because of all the oil refineries over there, and it's just like that's the place where people would go at 2 o'clock in the morning when bars closed on the Missouri side of the river and go to the Illinois side of the river because some could be open until 4. And when you're going into Cahokia, when you're down by Monk's Mound, which is where they sacrificed women and children and war captives, the entire row is just liquor shops and pawn stores, and it's all around these super industrial, soon-to-be remains of this civilization. So it's pretty easy for me, I think, to see that in an ecological scale, that all the things that we think are going to be problem solving, all the things that we think are going to be ways of figuring out how to change the trajectory of civilization to make it last, are just temporary. It's mathematically impossible, and that's what Joseph Tainter was really getting at. And there's a lineage of books and studies about this, and one of the main ones was I forget exactly when it was printed, but Dale and Carter's Topsoil and Civilization, and talking about the diminishing returns in terms of when you get to the point where you're hitting dust bowls and you get to the point where all these energy sources are used up and the fertilizer is used up, that's what caused civilizations to collapse. When they can no longer physically propagate themselves or continue producing a surplus, that's when they begin that process of collapse. And the extent to which the cycle goes complete, or the scenario in which, it's like we wake up one day and the power's on, and then we wake up the next day, the power's off, it's possible. It's exceptionally unlikely. There's things that we're doing or things that are happening in the civilization that can shift all that, which is, something about in Black and Green Review number 5, talking about some of the successful attempts to hack into the grid, or even people hacking into power stations. It's really hubris that drives civilization to thinking that we've got it smarter, we've got it better, we're going to figure this out. And reality is just lining everything up in a row to make it much easier for somebody to just turn civilization off. And that's something that no prior civilization has ever had before by any stretch of the imagination. Things where it could be a lot uglier, they could be a lot faster, they could be a lot more elaborate and prolonged than we're probably going to see. But looking at it in the terms of civilization being the history of civilizations arising and falling, collapsing, being swallowed by other civilizations, and then becoming this global monolith, that's unprecedented scale and insanely overconfident in trying to abolish any narrative of other ways of living or other ways of being. So it's not like even the small percentage of people in America who are farmers have knowledge about how to do things. They're just industrial farmers. They use industrial equipment. They use industrial fertilizers, and they're monocropping mass fields. There's not like innate knowledge within that they're suddenly going to be able to turn around like Mayan peasants might have, or peasants in a lot of these other societies that collapsed were able to just kind of go around and recreate that society in a small-scale means. That knowledge is gone. The infrastructure is gone. The equipment is gone, and it's been replaced by stuff that is just really predatory in the capitalistic sense of just saying, well, we're going to sell you this new thing every 3 years, and just planned obsolescence and everything. In that regard, I really just kind of laugh when I think about the idea that the civilization somehow has figured out, some of these civilizations that existed. I mean, Mesopotamian civilization lasted for thousands of years, and even like the Anasazi in America and Pueblo cultures, I mean, they had lasted for 500,000 years. The Cahokia, the civilization, I think 500 years off the top of my head, I could be wrong about that, but it's somewhere in that range, 500,000 years. And the American Empire, effectively is 200 to 250 years old, but the reason it got to be superpower status is because we weren't physically impacted by World War II the way that the rest of the world was. And the United States' role as a superpower, we're seeing that shift now. So, I mean, if you're talking about a 60, 70-year run in the history of civilizations, it's exceptionally small. But
like a candle in the wind.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a fucking nuclear-powered candle.
Yeah.
But it's just so easy for things to shift and so fast, and we're seeing that now because of the speed of technology, because of the way that the internet rules things. These things can happen really fast, but I don't like ascribing more prolonged intent on capitalists than they really have. I mean, they're a malicious bunch, and that's why when you're talking about peak energy, peak oil, and these are all still huge issues, but when the fracking boom started to happen, you had coal companies funneling money to anti-fracking activists to produce documentaries, and then you had fracking companies funneling money to anti-coal activists to make documentaries against each other. Like, you would think that the energy industry is just a cohesive unit that's just plotting and malicious, and they're plotting and malicious individually, but they're capitalists. They have no allegiance to each other outside of like global scheming about taxes and things like that.
And unions.
But I mean, just they know what they hate. They all hate the same things. They don't want regulation. They don't want unions. They don't want anything like that. They don't want people to stop buying, but they are cutthroat. That's why they're capitalists. They're not good people, and they're not smart people. They're just malicious, and they've learned to profit. But even talking about artificial intelligence and some of the things people come up with in terms of how they're going to program their way out of this mess, and a lot of hubbub goes to Kurzweil and his predictions for artificial intelligence, and saying like, this is his timeline for technological innovation. And in his timeline for innovation, he actually has in there that at a certain point we'll create a smart enough machine to figure out how to get us out of the ecological catastrophe we're facing. Like, no, we're not. Like, we're still dealing with leaking toxic waste that was put into barrels and buried into the earth 50 years ago because they figured out by now we'd understand how to handle depleted uranium. And our means for handling depleted uranium is to forget it.
Make it into weaponry.
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, who doesn't want to kill people in civilization, right?
Yeah.
But we really are just built around the idea that because we can create these technologies that are so flashier, because we can come up with these social changes, and they're happening at a crazy speed. I mean, the cell phone, half of the adult population of the world now uses a cell phone. No tool in the history of humanity spread across the entirety of our species at the same degree and speed at which a cell phone spread. Even the use of fire, the use of bows, none of those things were even as universal as the cell phone has become now, and that's in a matter of, say, 20 or 30 years since it became mass available. And I think it's up to now almost a third of the population of the world is using social media. I think 1.5 billion people have an active Facebook account, something like that. I mean, it might be bigger, it might be more than that now. It might be like 1.75. I mean, just that's insane. And it's easy to take that and use that as an exhibit to say, like, well, we're making huge changes. And it's like, that's just form. That's just management. It's a really effective way of getting people to not pay attention to what's actually happening around them and to get people to lose their framework for understanding, which is a huge thing. And I'm a huge proponent of Nicholas Carr's work, particularly The Shallows, talking about social media and neuroplasticity and how Google and Facebook and all these sites change the way that our brains actually take in information, which makes it so that we are not engaged in the world, as is obviously the case. But these, they take these kind of things and they say they're innovations, and they say that this is the future we've been waiting for. This is, we went beyond the point of pushing the narratives of progress to just, now nobody's thinking about the future. They're just waiting for the next updates, the next push notifications and things like that. And we really have created a truly insane situation. And by all means, it's a wet dream for people in the artificial intelligence world, and it's an ability for them to really kind of push the idea that they're not very far away from getting that chatbot that's going to pass the Turing examination or something like that. But realistically, what's happening is we're breeding humans that aren't going to pass the Turing tests if this goes on another 10 or 20 years, just because they've lost their ability to engage with the world at large and, to use their memories properly, because if Google's there to answer every question, there's no point in having wonder anymore. There's no point in having fleeting thoughts. It can be a YouTube conspiracy in 5 minutes. So these are radical changes, but they're not solutions. Yeah. And they're not going to be able to figure out the age-old problem of domesticators, which is how do we alter carrying capacity? And if chemical fertilizers couldn't do it, then Apple's not going to, that's for sure.
This is The Final Straw, and you're hearing the second half of my conversation with Kevin Tucker. Kevin is an anarcho-primitivist, author of numerous essays, editor of Black and Green Review, and a founder of Black and Green Press. Check out their site, blackandgreenpress.org, for things they've released. Keep an ear out in the next month for issue number 5 of Black and Green Review, and go ahead and check out the first half of our chat at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. Okay, so if we're creating a situation that is like materially untenable in terms of depletion of topsoil, pollution of water sources and air, in terms of our use of technologies that are decreasing our ability to exercise the brain and the parts of the body and the social skills that we've developed as social beings over this, over the millennia and millions of years that we've developed as a species. All this, the next question I have is, you brought up near the beginning of the conversation the model that anarcho-primitivists in particular propose towards resistance and towards reclaiming, being the idea of rewilding, and you counterpose this to the idea of revolution. Can you play out a little bit about what the difference between those two concepts are, and give a good definition for rewilding for the listening audience?
So I tend to put it as, like, for most intensive purposes, the notion of like the backpacker or the ecologist or the environmentalist, their idea is to go out there and observe. And I mean, you have the phrase, leave only footprints, take only pictures or whatever. The idea behind rewilding is, you go beyond just observation and become a part of that wildness again. And as I will continue to hammer in, these are things that are within us. I mean, there isn't some set of knowledge and set of skills that are just gone. It's just that there's a lot of some of the knowledge takes a lot more work to regain, but we have the framework for it, the way that we take in information and the way we interact. The framework is there, but wildness does exist, and it's not just like I want to make the distinction too between wildness and wilderness. Wildness is the state of being. It's the general chaotic nature of not controlling the world, and the fact that all living beings are going to continue to be free, and to continue to exist as they have, as they will. No species willingly walks into captivity aside from human beings who've been raised there, ones that have been forced there. It's a tough term, and I think anarcho-primitivism obviously has a lot of critique about language itself and how we perceive the world, and how symbolic culture and things like that have impacted even the framework for discussion, and how written language in particular has changed the way that we use these words, and we can get very particular about it. But it comes down to the idea that people think wilderness and wildness are the same thing. Wilderness is a place; it's a designated area. It's a area that is where the wild things are. But the flip side of that is this notion that there is control, and that the city is a fully manicured, intentionally created space. But even there's no permanence to it. If you turn off the air conditioning and skyscrapers and towers like that, they're going to start eroding very quickly. If you're not constantly spraying, which I think that I had read in New York City, I forget when the study I read this was from, but I think maybe 2012 or 2013, there was like 500 applications of glyphosate within New York City. And I've argued with anarchists that are coming from different egoist or perspectives, nihilist perspectives, and they're like, well, this is here and that's how it's going to be. And I like to be in a lot of areas where things did just let go. People stopped maintaining it. And I live in an area now that is exceptionally wild, but hardly pristine. And most of that just comes down to, like, it was a company town area 100 years ago for lead mining, and then they just basically the industry collapsed and it stopped being a company town. A lot of these areas went and they were logged, and now they're regrowing mostly with varying degrees of invasive pines and things like that. But the wildness still exists, and there's all these wild beings and wild creatures that come back as the space is available and well beyond our realm of knowledge. Wildness is really just that area that we can't control, and that exists within us as much as it does around us. But I've talked to people who live in cities, and they're like, well, how do I, all this wildness stuff sounds great, but it has no meaning to me. It's like, that's not true. Because you see birds around, you see all these animals, you see all these insects. They're trying to do what they do, and some of them are slightly more opportunistic than others, but they are being wild, even if they're in an area that is fully domesticated and concrete. And they will find those areas where other wild creatures come in, and you can look at areas in India where I think it was like cheetahs and leopards had been coming into the cities at night to raid for mice and then smaller mammals, predators that will hunt mice within the city limits. And you'll see that with coyotes and with fox. They'll be in very urban and suburban areas because they know all these other species are going to be, relative opportunists to the mess that we make with civilization, and they're just going to go hunt. So it is everywhere. I mean, it is within us, it is around us, and it's very easy to kind of put this into sort of quasi-religious terms, which I don't like to do. I think that one of the most important aspects of wildness is the lack of ability to really define and categorize it. For me, it is very much a spiritual connection, and I am exceptionally anti-theistic. I just despise the notion of religion. I think that a living spirituality can have myths, can have a lot of things, but as soon as you turn those myths into or write them down and give them power, that's how you form religion, and that's how you can use them to impose upon other people, rather than just build a community around the idea of, how do we answer or how do we discuss things that we don't understand, which are existential questions that have a whole lot of meaning within civilization, where we don't have community, we do second-guess everything. You don't have those kinds of problems in egalitarian communities, obviously. But, the idea of rewilding is that wildness is all around and does exist, and you can partake in it. I mean, it's not just the skill set, it's not just, being able to identify all the plants and everything like that, but the more that you engage it as a whole, and the more that you give up control and you give up kind of some of the preconceived notions that we have because of science and because of this really biological, socio-biological perspective of nature is Hobbesian and angry and out to get you and just conquest of the fittest and all these garbage notions that we've imposed upon the world. As you experience the world, you can erode those notions and then becoming a part of that community rather than a voyeur within it. Having humility imposed on you by the wild, by getting challenged about some of these core assumptions that we have, even coming from ecological or environmentalist backgrounds about the way that wild things work and interact with each other. It's usually a lot more simple and a lot more meaningful and intentional even than we want to give anything credit for. Just like one example of that is the largest living and oldest living organism in the entire world, as an organism itself, not talking about the planet itself, obviously, is a honey mushroom, and particularly one in the Pacific Northwest. Well, gardeners and horticulturalists consider honey mushrooms to be a pest because they kill trees. The honey mushroom itself is a habitat creator. In an area like the Pacific Northwest where there are fires naturally, honey mushrooms can predate on trees that already have weaknesses to them. And in that ecosystem, if they kill those trees, obviously there's a lot of ecological things that come from dead trees, including homes for other animals, food for other animals, and insect ecologies, and in this case, a fungus itself, to continue propagating. But if there's dead trees, it creates a fire break for when those fires go through. So they actually help create entire regions by selecting trees that are already dead or dying to feed off of. There's things here that are just like, things are a lot more simple and a lot more complicated than we want to give them credit for, but it really requires breaking out of some of these things that we've been raised to know about the way the world works. And I think that the applications of that are massive in terms of saying, like, where do we go from here as individuals, as communities? But the other part of it as well is that this is the big difference between talking about rewilding and talking about rewilding and resistance and then talking about revolution. And the idea of revolution is ideological in nature. We're going to build a resistance to this state, to this civilization, based on this ideology. We're going to build propaganda built around the idea of the society and the blueprint of society that we believe can happen. It's a very organized thing, and it's very much based off of a lot of populism and based off of a lot of kind of brouhaha and conjecture around what is or what is not to be, or in Lenin's case, what is to be done. And then, over time, you can start with really great ideas as revolutionaries, and there's not a single instance of the history of revolutions where you could really look at it and say, like, from point A to point B, if they were successful, if we want to say they were successful, where things didn't go really badly. And so there was even, like, in the anarchist context, a lot of anarchists had support for the Russian Revolution, and then as soon as they had success in talking about
the overthrow of the Tsar and like the pushing back of the white armies and stuff like that.
Yeah, and all that, and then there was a lot of deflections and things like that, and then the communists and the socialists wanted to kill the anarchists. But I mean, you can't overlook the fact that the idea that they had wasn't very far off from Berkman, who said that, for me it was laughable. I wrote an essay called The Failure of Revolution. It was really kind of like that last bit of me that was holding on to revolution with cautious optimism and finally giving up on the notion. This essay was kind of my push-off point from when it's like, okay, I can't stand behind it anymore. But Berkman's idea was that industrial society could survive because people would be happier to work for a proletariat-run state society and would produce more and increase production because they were happier about working for that system. And anybody who's had a job can tell you it's like, that doesn't work that way. Like, if you're working in a factory, the only one singing in a coal mine is the canary. Like, nobody wants to do that stuff. And there's a reason that, for 99.99999 infinity % of our existence, there wasn't work. There wasn't labor for somebody else's profit, and which you're paid a penance, and then, you get to buy back a piece of your own livelihood from. There's labor. There's things that we did that take energy, they take time, but you have a community doing it, and everybody gains from it. And, people who want to work together, people who want to hunt together, people want to gather together. I mean, it's pretty simple. It wasn't this contracted thing, and I mean, they're talking about things like shoe factories and, you know, straight up industrial labor. And, you know, at the time, you can really see with a historical lens, particularly, say we're in places like Pittsburgh in the early 1900s where children were having rickets because there was so much smoke covering the sky that they weren't getting sunlight. You know, you think about little newsy kids and chimney sweeps and things like that. Yeah, the fact that they could own a piece of it made a lot of sense with their very limited worldview that they were presented by living in industrial cities at that time, where the average life expectancy was 31 years old. So the notion that we can still kind of naively hold on to some of that utopian optimism based off of very limited historical circumstance, to me, it doesn't add up. And then, you know, that's why there was a lot of romanticism involved in the industrial process and involved in even the industrial enterprise at that time that had no basis in reality, but it just seemed a lot better than the existing alternative. And so the idea that you could create liberation in that context, it makes sense historically, but that's it. And it's hard to say that you can have revolution without having that degree of romantic naivete. And especially if you want to build a populist army that's going to theoretically take on the state. And at the time, in the early 1900s, you know, they didn't have nuclear power. They barely had planes. You know, the standing armies certainly had a chance and resistance. And I mean, that's why you had revolutions at that time that were successful, even if you don't want to weigh them against their own propaganda, which, you know, obviously the Russian Revolution, Cuban Revolution, they killed a ton of their own people. And if you get into Asian socialist states, obviously, you know, even gets as bad, if not worse.
So maybe a positive that could be said about the ideal of using a method of rewilding as an approach towards undermining the state and capital and industrial civilization is that it's people grasping at the tools for their own immediate survival and reacclimatizing themselves to their more historical state of being and their surroundings, as well as a more decentralized possibility for insurgency, as opposed to like a centralized revolutionary party or force that could then be turned against dissident elements of the population. Is that like maybe one way of putting it, or?
Yeah, and I would also add that I'm exceptionally adamant about the community aspect. And I know that there's a lot of kind of new agey liberal shit kind of stuff that floats around with that concept. But I mean, if you're looking at the hunter-gatherer band and the way that these societies work, I mean, community is a core part of who we are, and the entire individualist core of anarchist thinking, I think, is a huge civilized issue. And that comes back to neoteny, and I think that that's one of the parts that really needs to be challenged. But by all means, the basic comparison that I always draw is the difference between revolutionary insurgency and indigenous resistance. And it's like the revolutionaries are willing to kill for an idea. The indigenous resistors were willing to die for their societies or die for their communities. And it's because it wasn't an idea, is what they know. And of course, I'm not trying to historicize this. Indigenous resistance is obviously still exceptionally vital, real, and existing. But if you know what you're fighting for, and if you feel it, instead of just think about it and think that we're going to create some new society, and think that nothing. And I'm from the perspective nothing new is coming. There's got to be new forms of technology. There's got to be new forms of the things that we're doing. They're going to be worse potentially than they are now. But you know, as a materialist, I mean, you really look at subsistence methods, and I get into this with other anarchists all the time. They're like, think that there's some determinism in saying subsistence matters, and it's like, how are you going to eat? How are people going to eat? We're not coming up with something new unless you're a transhumanist and you think technology is going to go some crazy new direction, and we're going to use 3D printers to produce, organic vegan gardens or something like that. It's been done, and it's been done by people who are more experienced and more well-intentioned, and in a lot of cases, it didn't look so good. And that's where you get these patriarchal warrings, occurring in horticultural societies. We have to be honest about that too. What did these societies look like over generations? What do they look like in 100 years? Not just what do we think is going to happen and magically trying to make it exist. I think that that's vitally important. And I think people think it's like kind of an option or a choice to say it's like, oh, you rewild or you resist. No, I mean, the idea is build communities of resistance. And as we've seen in the anti-oil extraction pipeline and fracking resistance movements that have been happening, for a long time, but have gotten a lot of attention in Americas recently, like that's the core of it. That's what made some of these camps more successful than any ecological campaign and tree sitting campaigns and things like that. It's like they built structures, they moved their society, they reinforced the society that they knew in that area, and they said about it as, this is the way our life is. This is what we're doing. We're going to defend this land because this is what we do. And revolutionaries are never going to have that. It's just not going to happen. And if they do, it's usually because there's, defending a gulag.
I guess the really easy example for me of what you're describing is the ZAD at Notre-Dame-des-Landes in France, or that's been mostly lived on, I guess, for the last 8 years as a point of resistance with fighting the police when necessary, but blocking the airport from the city of Nantes from expanding out there. It's a really inspirational example of people living and fighting in the same place as well as creating the kind of world that they want where they are and sustaining themselves as much as possible from it by growing their own food and, welcoming in travelers and doing presentations and having dances and art. And it's pretty awesome. It seems like a different way of living.
And I believe intentionally so.
Yeah.
That's good. And the other part of it too is that in terms of collapse, it's kind of left over there from before. The other part of it is accepting and understanding that collapse is a process that is happening. So it's not just a matter of waiting it out, but understanding history, understanding the way that the civilization works, understanding what it's dependent on, and understanding the role of resource extraction and oil and peak energy. You can really find the weak spots. And I moved from Pennsylvania because of the fracking. Areas I had loved have been absolutely destroyed, and for our lifetimes, most likely. And it's just a situation that's going to keep getting worse. These lines that were buried by puppet companies that were set up to keep things constantly moving, so nobody was held accountable. They weren't marked, and people will hit them with home equipment or something like that, and they blow. But understanding kind of that cash grab mentality behind some of these flash-in-the-pan efforts to prolong civilization exposes the weak points. And if we can build communities of resistance, if we can find these areas where they're saying out of desperation, if they're willing to do the things that they have done because of fracking within the United States, and even in cases, the first time I ever saw a fracking well was a blown fracking well in 30 feet away from the siding of a house that probably cost $400,000 or $500,000. I mean, these are rich people. If they're willing to do this stuff in backyards of first world people and often affluent first world people, that's desperation. And if you can make your stand at that point, or if you can try and build that community and build up that sense of awareness and acknowledgement about what's happening, and even just pointing out to people as they're coming after your water, and this is why, that's a really solid point to be working off of and trying to building resistance around, and not trying to make even more grandiose notions. I think it's a good starting point for opening people up to the entirety of civilization and its ecocidal, suicidal rampage, and exposing in the way this parasitic, self-destructive drive that capitalists can have. And again, pointing out, as you mentioned earlier, didn't really get talked about, kind of the shock capitalism stuff where, they are able to profit off of disaster. And that's a huge thing. And I think there's a lot to be said about it, but it doesn't say anything about for the longevity of an industrial civilization.
Yeah, there's a lot to be, there's to talk, bring it back to Standing Rock, for instance, which you seem to allude to as one example of people taking space and defending land that they're on. Water is life is a pretty simple, universal, in and of itself statement to make. And at the point at which you're arguing against that, you're showing your cards of being absolutely anti-life and a very bad neighbor also.
Yeah. when you're arguing against water, you'd hope that you could just, the only way that you could argue against water is life is that you're just in a fucking vacuum on Facebook or on social media, and you're just arguing against. And again, I think a lot of this stuff comes down to, and it's the way that the anarchist world has been for a while now, but the world at large is just stake your ground and argue, and trying to get likes and trying to get this echo chamber of Google and Facebook and whatever else to reward you for your contribution to the trolling or the cause or whatever it is that you think you're doing. It's just knee-jerk reactionism and self-validation. And that's a huge issue. Got to get off the phone and get off the internet.
Yeah. Well, so I guess to wrap up a little bit, you've mentioned Black and Green Review a couple times, and I mentioned it in the introduction, but you're one of the founders of Black and Green Press, which I would imagine is a tip of the hat to Lorraine and Freddie's Black and Red Press, the publication company that they ran and put so many amazing books out through. But number 5 of Black and Green Review is about Do. Can you tell listeners what more they can expect from it, where they can find it, and how to contribute to number 6?
Yeah, so it's hopefully going to be to the press within the next couple of weeks. Our website is blackandgreenreview.org, and then blackandgreenpress.org. I've been a little lazier about updating. But we do have a mailing list on there, and that's probably the best way, because I despise social media. We do post some updates from time to time on, say, Facebook or Instagram, but I try to have absolutely nothing to do with it and try and get other people to do it as well. But we don't really have themes with the issues, just because they tend to be large. It is a journal book format, and the idea behind it is that this is something that is meant to have some permanence. So it's not a magazine, it's not something that's going to really date. So, issue 1 we have free online, we sold out. It's on archive, and I have links from blackandgreenreview.org and blackandgreenpress.org, I believe. But they're definitely up there, so you can check it out. I'm really excited about the project, and I'm really excited about each issue, just because as editors, we're really damn hard on each other at times, but we really try to push each other, and I think that what we've done with Black and Green Review, we have editors from, I was the editor of Species Trader Journal, and I did a lot of work with Green Anarchy. John Zerzan is one of the editors, and obviously one of the principal editors of Green Anarchy magazine. We really tried to take what we saw as the lasting important sides of that, and, with the internet, you do get the action news all the time, so that stuff, which is frankly kind of a pain to do in the journals and stuff like that, we could offset and we could focus on, the Primal War section within Black and Green Review, taking a look at specific actions that did happen and really getting to analyze them and getting to talk about different angles of a combination of collapse and resistance, and how the interplay between those two things works, and also looking at things like the extraction industries and the depths that they're willing to go. Like the last issue had a thing on fracking and the bubble around it. This issue looking at lead pipes and poisoning of children, and then also towns in Peru that were completely destroyed by lead smelters that are making batteries for solar panels. Really getting the chance to take that deeper dive and dig in on these issues. But I think in terms of almost even anarchist history, the depth that we've been able to really explore and all these gaps we've been able to fill within anti-civilization anarchists, green anarchists, and anarcho-primitivist ideas over, we're going into our 5th issue right now. We don't see ourselves as just talking to anarchists right now. And also a big part of it, too, is having a physical format, something that you'll actively engage in instead of just more content on the internet to read the title of and click and post around. Yeah, this issue, if I get to the press in about 2 or 3 weeks, it should be I'd say about 2 months from now. So going into November-ish at some point that it'll be coming out. But as soon as I get it figured out with the printer and everything like that, I'll start putting pre-order information up. Aside from that, in Black and Green Press, before the end of the year, I'll also have Gathered Remains, which is my second collection of essays. My first collection of essays was For Wildness and Anarchy, and I hope to have the revised edition of that to the printer by the end of the year. But we also just put out, as I mentioned, the reprint of Freddie Perlman's Anything Can Happen, which is a great collection of essays, and sadly only increasing in relevance as we're seeing the resurgent rise of neopopulism and pro-tribalism, nationalism, and fervor, and stuff like that. I think that's particularly good, especially a lot of the stuff's attacking communism and socialism, because we're seeing, in response to this alt-right stuff, communism isn't getting a little bit kick again. But the underlying premise of everything is really, understanding where it is we're coming from, where it is we're going, and as wild social animals and beings, what role we have within this resistance, and what that lineage that we have is. That, as Freddie did such an excellent job of pointing out, it goes back to the beginning of civilization. As soon as there was domestication, there were people who resisted it, and we are a part of that lineage, so we want to keep that going until the end.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time. I've enjoyed this conversation very much.
Thank you for having it.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
From the studios of Asheville FM, 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. If you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you're free to do so. If you choose to do it, just send us an email. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville, specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.